All right, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about exercise prescription. When do we decide what areas to progress? When do we decide to pull back on load or regress in exercise? When do we want to push? So the first thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is the kind of the three dials of exercise prescription. First one I like to think about is the spatial aspects of exercise prescription. So in this, we have the plane of motion, we have the base of support, we have location of the load, and we have static or dynamic. So plane of motion obviously is going to be your sagittal plane, your frontal plane movements, and your transverse. But also, is it a vertical pressing motion or a horizontal pressing motion for the upper body? From a base of support standpoint, we're thinking first bilateral symmetrical movements like a squat. We're thinking lower body push strategies. Then we're moving maybe to bilateral asymmetrical. So we're doing maybe a split squat, which would be static as it pertains to position. The next one would be obviously going from bilateral symmetrical to asymmetrical to a unilateral movement. So it could be a skater squat or a pistol squat, those types of things. Location of the load is another one to think about. So you could have it in an area where it is very symmetrical and along midline, so a goblet squat. You could want to bias load to one side or the other. So maybe you go to a front rack position. So now I'm holding weight on my right side, squatting through. Depending on the person and that constraint, they may shift off of it and it might preferentially load the opposite side or the same side, the ipsilateral side. That's something you would work with on that individual. You could also look at suitcase positions. If you did double front rack with a dumbbell or even a barbell, maybe you're looking at trying to get them in a more vertical position to bias quad loading, or you're taking that barbell and you're putting it on their back. Low bar, back squat position might preferentially load glutes a little bit more. And then you're looking at static versus dynamic. So we kind of took the example of a bilateral symmetrical squat position or bilateral asymmetrical squat position, so split squat. And this would be considered maybe more of a static in terms of position on the floor. We can make that more dynamic in turning that same movement, a bilateral asymmetrical movement, into a linear or anterior lunge. So I'm having to absorb force or dynamically, I'm having to balance. There's some demands in that regard. That is the spatial dial of exercise prescription. Next, we're going to run into temporal. Temporal, instead of just thinking of only time, I like to think of more of like velocity or the speed of movement or how fast somebody is accelerating or decelerating. And ultimately, we're looking at time under tension. So with this dial especially, this is how you can shift something further along the x-axis when it comes to the force velocity curve. So something like this. Oops, bad marker. So if we're looking at the force velocity curve, and what typically looks like this, we're looking at the x-axis right here. So how do we do that? As well as if we're going slower, we're allowed to put more force output, and we're going higher up that curve. And that would be maybe slow strength or maybe looking at hypertrophy. So things to think about with temporal are speed and acceleration, how fast is the movement, and time under tension. So ultimately you're looking at what is the, I don't want to just say duration because that can come down to dosage, but how much time elapses for each repetition of moving a weight or performing a jump, those types of things. And then lastly, we like to talk about the dosage dial. So this is simple exercise prescription at its core of sets and reps, the duration of an activity if you're thinking aerobic sports or endurance sports, and then load, internal versus external. So from an internal load standpoint, it's RPE, rate of perceived exertion. We're looking at reps in reserve. We're looking at percent intensity. If you're cueing somebody, I want you to do this repetition at 60% of your max speed, those types of things. And then external obviously being like truly what is the load placed on the individual in terms of holding weight or resistance under a flywheel, those types of things. I'd say external is a more objective measure, whereas internal is going to be more of your subjective markers of load. And then another one, just a way to quantify dosage, would be mileage for more of your endurance athletes. So when you're looking at progressing an exercise, you're considering all three of these dials. And how many are you going to turn at once when you go to progress somebody? If I had somebody doing a squat, a goblet squat to start, and the next session I have them come in and we're going to do, okay, now we're going to do a split squat holding weight on one side, and now I want you to jump with it, so it's going to be a much faster movement. That is several dials all at once. If they came in and their knee was angry, I wouldn't know which one of those alterations caused their knee to hurt. So I always talk about with my students, you probably only want to change 1 to 2 of these properties to maximum when you're progressing on a session by session or a week by week duration. So you're always looking at, like, if I make this change, will I know what the outcome is? Next thing to consider is when you're progressing or regressing exercises, you're looking at, am I able to apply enough stress to achieve an adaptation? So we're thinking about general adaptation theory of, if I'm applying a stress, if it is enough, it can cause us to have a supraphysiological response. So we get stronger, we get faster, those types of things. Or is it a sub-maximal intensity? So it's not enough to actually drive those adaptations. Either way, you can look at, we're either progressing or regressing. We're gaining adaptation or losing adaptation. So you're trying to find what is enough stress to achieve the desired adaptation. What is that sweet spot? Ultimately, we're looking at things like progressive overload here. The way I like to think about progressive overload is it is the aggregation of small marginal changes over a longer period of time. Just like investing in the stock market, daily, weekly, monthly additions to your stock profile will ultimately yield a larger gain than if you're trying to time the market and just pick it at the exact moment when it's at the bottom or it's at the top and selling, those types of things. We're looking at what is sustainable. So progressive overload is going to ultimately increase their resilience to injury or resistance to injury. It's going to improve their recoverability. It's going to improve ultimately their envelope of function, as Dye would put it. So there's two types of ways of thinking about exercise prescription or periodization. We have linear periodization and we have undulating periodization. I want to focus a lot on linear periodization because I think about, for the vast majority of people that you're seeing in an outpatient physical therapy setting or even in a strength and conditioning setting, they are going to probably be appropriate for linear periodization. One, because it's more simplistic. Two, it allows you to kind of, in a processed manner, progress somebody or know when you've done too much and pull back. There's less things you're having to consider, so there's less cognitive load and having to think about as many things. So from a linear periodization, these are small marginal gains at very regular intervals. Those progression intervals are going to vary on whether somebody is just starting a program or if they're more experienced. So if we're thinking early on in a program, they're probably going to be able to progress more frequently because intensity is probably not that much. Think about somebody starting a rehab program that is 6-week post-op ACL. Maybe we want to start doing true strength and conditioning to start building enough muscle to do impact at 12 weeks. We don't exactly know what their 1 rep max is, and we don't want to just guess with a higher weight that we know would achieve a muscular adaptation if their knee is not ready for it and it's going to cause them to have reactive swelling, lose range of motion, not be able to walk comfortably, having a setback. So you're probably starting at a sub-maximal threshold and building up over time to accumulate workload. Because of that, you can progress maybe more on a session-by-session basis or a week-by-week basis with that individual. An example of how this might look is if we had them do, grab the wrong marker again, let's see about this one. 3 sets of 10 of a 45-pound goblet squat. I might ask that individual, you just completed 3 sets of 10 at 45 pounds. Next session, do you feel like you'd be able to go up in repetitions, or do you think you'd be able to go up in weight? They say, I don't think I can go up in weight. I'm going to go up in repetitions next time. Great. Maybe next session or next week, we're doing 3 sets of 12 at 45 pounds. The next session, they say, I think I can go up in weight. Great. I might pull back on repetitions here because I'm increasing load, and I might go up to 55 pounds. And at the end of that session, they tell me, I don't think I could do any more repetitions, and I think that load feels about right. I don't think I can go to more than 55 right now. Perfect. The next session or next time we do that exercises, I might do 4 sets at that. And this would be iterative, and you would do this over and over again until you kind of get to a point where they start to level off. And now you know they've achieved workload there. They're starting to hit more of a physiological load that could drive adaptations. They're also able to do much more. They've accumulated a workload at that point. So they're in a much better spot. You also know along the way with each of these changes, if their knee starts to get really cranky, you know kind of a threshold. All right, this is where we're at. We might have to spend just a little bit more time at step 2. Or we might instead of changing our dosage here, we might opt to change either the temporal or spatial aspects of that exercise. This, like I said, is ideal when in a rehab setting, when they don't have any workload established. General physical prep, so your general population clients and those with lower training age, this is going to be something that's very, very good for them because you can accumulate workload, you can accumulate volume, you might be able to do a higher density of training because the intensity is lower. It's very good. I like this a lot for my chronic pain patients that I know the intensity is not going to be from a load standpoint. We're going to go lower intensity because they can't tolerate higher intensities. This is a good way to demonstrate progress over time to them. And I think these subjective markers of load from that third dial in exercise prescription are something like RPE and RIR, reps in reserve. That might be very appropriate for that individual. And then finally, let's review undulating. We'll spend not as much time on this because not everybody is going to need this aspect of things, but I think it's something important to understand. So undulating periodization is small marginal gains coupled with planned sessions or periods of deload. An example of this might be somebody that is in a performance setting where they have a high day of training and a low day of training. That high day of training is going to be the day that we go for it. They come in, they're feeling good, they're feeling green light. We're going to progress and push. Now, we might be working at levels of 90% plus of their 1 rep max. We also might be trying to push that 1 rep max higher. So we might try to get off that scale of percentages and just see what can we do. We need to achieve this weight to show progress. Because of how high in intensity and volume that day might be, we're going to couple that with a low day. So they might do a high day Monday, and then Thursday they might come in and do a low day. So they do small deloads for recovery and maintenance. You're taking a slight step back in the intensity to allow recovery, allow more time for adaptations to occur, and you're not just pushing 100% max all the time where somebody might run into issues. I said this is typically, the ideal population is maybe more of a performance setting or somebody that's achieved a higher volume and a higher intensity and overall higher training age. But I've used this in late stage PT for an ACL athlete that is somebody that's going to get into those higher intensities and volumes and levels of competition. They might be at a point where I do need to do a high day and a low day in PT if they're still coming in regularly twice a week. But I'd say the vast majority of your people, if you own linear periodization, you'll be in a very, very good spot, and that person will be progressed regularly. Ultimately, when you're determining whether or not somebody should progress or regress from an exercise, progressions are going to be guided on if that person has demonstrated competency with that movement, they have accumulated time with that movement or load that's appropriate for the intensity and volume of it, and they're doing it confidently. The other option would be if I don't think we're achieving the desired adaptation of strength power or elasticity, I might do that as the therapist. In those areas, that's kind of a green light situation that we have all four of those where somebody should be progressing exercise, especially if they don't have symptoms. Now, on the flip side, when do we regress exercise? It's the exact opposite of what we just said. If they're not confident with it and you've tried to give them time to adapt and learn that movement, especially if it's novel, it might just be too challenging for them. If they're not able to do it repeatedly with good outcomes, again, have you asked them if they've had enough time to gain movement competence with it? Are they learning it? Or is it, again, just too challenging? Obviously, as well as the longer you spend at that higher, maybe you need to deload as well because you need to give them some more time to recover and adapt. But obviously, the most obvious of when we would want to regress an exercise is if somebody is having an adverse response to it. So that reactive swelling extends greater than 48 hours. It vastly changed what their day-to-day life looked like from a symptom standpoint. So that concludes kind of a little talk on exercise prescription, when to progress and regress. Drop your comments below. Like, subscribe, share, all that. Coming back with another question soon.